Although the deist movement developed quite rapidly in the 17th and especially in the 18th century, it's still quite difficult to identify anyone you could call an explicit atheist. All the same, in the middle of the 17th century, we come face to face with someone who is perilously close to it. Thomas Hobbes, the son of a Wiltshire vicar, who spent much of his life as a tutor to the children of aristocracy, including at one time the young boy who would become King Charles II. His philosophy was completely materialist or monist, not unlike the classical philosophers he'd studied, Epicurus, Democritus, and Lucretius. Hobbes denied any idea of the immaterial. His target was conventional religion.
What is so fascinating about Hobbes's criticisms is that he uses a lot of the arguments the most conservative apologists for established religion use, and then ingeniously reverses them. So conservative apologists for religion often say, look at all the sects. Don't you see how bad and dangerous it is to leave the path of the one true faith? Hobbes simply turns the argument round and says, don't you see that the appalling history of sectarianism, persecution, heresy hunting shows you that this way of thinking about the world is intrinsically unsound? Hobbes lays the ground for atheism partly because he is what philosophers call a monist. There is only one kind of stuff in the world, which is matter. And it's the matter that we see and feel and sense and touch, and there's nothing else.
The universe, the whole mass of all things that are, is corporeal, that is to say, body, and hath the dimensions of magnitude, length, breadth, and depth. Every part of the universe is body, and that which is not body is no part of the universe. And because the universe is all, that which is no part of it is nothing, and consequently, nowhere.
I think, again, what I take to be decisive about Hobbes' intervention in the middle of the 17th century is that he manages brilliantly to pull together a whole series of arguments that are distributed in the pagan philosophical tradition, in classical antiquity.
With Democritus and Epicurus.
They're systematized, they're turned into a coherent philosophical program, and what that meant was, perhaps more than anything else in the English tradition, that you rarely get an argument against atheistical philosophy that, as it were, it's not systematic. What I think matters, both historically and philosophically, about Hobbes's work is that it provides most of the important philosophical resources for atheism afterwards.
So have we found our first outright atheist? For Hobbes, the scholastic notion of the immaterial soul was as self-contradictory and meaningless as a circular rectangle. You might assume, therefore, that Hobbes was reluctant to accept the immortality of the soul. But although he frequently makes indirect hints to that effect, he prudently hedges his bets. He even concedes the idea of resurrection on the Day of Judgment, and by the same token, he reluctantly recognizes that there was, after all, a divine origin to the universe, a prime mover that set it all going. Considering the overall tone of his discourse and its otherwise radically materialist attitude, it's quite startling to find Hobbes' tomb displayed in his local church in Derbyshire. After all, many people did think that Hobbes was an atheist, or at least the encourager of atheists.
Not one English infidel in 100 is any other than a Hobbist, which I know to be rank atheism.
Throughout the last part of the 17th century, the members of Parliament hotly debated bills designed to combat what many thought was the blasphemy of disbelief. In fact, the 1697 Blasphemy Act, when it finally became law, made no specific mention of atheism. This, then, is the first actual act in Parliament. Although it's clear when you look at the original wording of these 300-year-old documents that atheists would have been caught in their net. Any persons having been educated in or at any time having made profession of the Christian religion within this realm shall by writing, printing, what is that? Or earthing or advised, speaking, deny any of the persons of the Holy Trinity to be God. And then this was sort of hastily put in here.
Yes, that's an amendment. That was
an amendment.
To the Act, yes.
As if someone said, oh, and who shall incidentally, what is it, insist that there is more than one God. I mean, I love the idea of two parliamentary clerks sitting side by side and saying, oh, do mention polytheism, otherwise they may get in under the wire. What is it? Deny the Christian religion to be true, or the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be of divine authority, and shall upon
indictment or information.
However, the debates and the bills that preceded the passing of the final Blasphemy Act did specify atheism, which shows how seriously the subject was taken. Now, let's see what they're talking about. Or was it the crying sins?
Crying sins of atheism and blasphemy.
That if any person being the age of 16, is it? 16
Yes.
years or more,
Yes.
not being visibly and apparently distracted and out of his wits by sickness or natural infirmity, or not, and being a natural fool void of common sense, shall, after this act, by word or writing, deny that there is a God. And then there's all stuff about our Lord the Saviour. And what do they say they're going to do to the poor soul?
I noticed, talking about the benefit of the clergy, and there shall be judgment of death passed upon him, and execution shall follow without pardon or reprieve.
And this is for blasphemy or for atheism?
An act for the punishing of atheism and blasphemy.
As soon as I get to this stuff and see what people were doing, I feel my pulse racing and a sort of an atheist's virtuous indignation beginning to spurt out.
Blasphemous libels.
Ah. While the early deists were busy reconstructing Christianity, at the same time being very careful to avoid the accusation of atheism, the world of science had been steadily progressing. The Copernican view of the universe may have convinced the freest thinkers, but even with the support of Kepler and Galileo, it seemed mathematically flawed, and no one really knew how it was supposed to work exactly until, as Alexander Pope famously said,
Nature and nature's laws lay hid by night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light.
As with so many slogans of this sort, Pope's famous couplet, of course, is an oversimplification. But Isaac Newton's theories about gravity and about the laws of motion certainly made it impossible now for intelligent men to adhere to the earth-centered universe that the Catholic Church was still so insistent about. Now, the extent to which Newton's Christianity differed from Anglican orthodoxy didn't become fully apparent until his previously unknown religious writings were discovered in the last century. But it's now quite clear that his scientific achievements were closely related to his religious convictions, and that he was convinced that God revealed himself in words just as much as he did in creative acts. It seems that two patterns are emerging when it comes to the role of science in the history of disbelief. One, which we've already seen when we were looking at Copernicus and Galileo, is that most of the scientists involved, and that included Newton, remained firm believers, either in spite of, or in most cases, actually because of their science. Well, the second pattern is to be seen amongst people who are not actually scientists, intellectuals, and in some cases theologians, who found it quite easy to reconcile the new scientific discoveries with their belief in the existence of an omnipotent being. The Reverend Samuel Clarke, for example, arrived in Trinity College, Cambridge, shortly after the publication of Newton's Principia. In 1704, he was invited to deliver one of a set of lectures which Robert Boyle, one of Newton's most distinguished colleagues in the Royal Society, had instituted to establish the truth of the Christian religion against infidels. Clarke's first series of lectures were entitled A Demonstration of the Being and Attributes of God, more particularly in answer to Mr. Hobbes, Spinoza, and their followers. Like many of his 16th century predecessors, Clarke identified three distinct classes of atheists. There were those, as he said,
the stupid and ignorant, who have never made any just use of their natural reason to discover even the plainest and most obvious truths.
Then there were those who,
by vicious and degenerate life, corrupt the principles of their nature, and are resolved not to hearken to any reasoning.
And finally, there were those who were both moral and reasonable, whose own speculations had convinced them that the atheist position is more strong and conclusive. And it's the third group that contains, as Clarke says,
the only atheistical persons to whom the present discourse can be supposed to be directed, or who are indeed capable of being reasoned with at all.
Now, in contrast to Descartes, the French philosopher of the previous century, for whom the most significant argument in favor of God's existence was the fact that he was to be found as one of the indubitable ideas in our mind, in other words, that we simply knew of his existence, and since we had that knowledge, it must be God-given, Clarke, like Newton, referred to the objective evidence of celestial mechanics. And like many authors, before and after, Clarke also invoked biology as evidence of intelligent design.
The late discoveries in anatomy and physics, the circulation of the blood and the exact structure of the heart and brain bear insensible marks of conscious contrivance.
Well, in spite of its apparently rigid logic, the religious conclusions which Clarke arrived at don't necessarily follow from the mechanical evidence which he cites. Like Newton, after all, he was a pious Christian, predisposed to visualize nature as the expression of omnipotent intelligence. All the same, the fact that a mathematically literate clergyman had so little difficulty in reconciling Newtonian mechanics with the notion of a supreme being goes to show that the conflict between religion and the increasingly mechanized picture of the natural world has been seriously exaggerated. As we've already seen, ever since the Reformation, there's a sense in which the road to atheism was paved not with science, but with religious intentions. The efforts of deists such as Hobbes to create a more reasonable form of religion had unknowingly helped to forge the very weapons that would eventually be turned against the whole idea of religion. Hobbes lived out the last years of his life here in the elegant home of the Devonshire family, whose children he had tutored. I'd be here for another 4 programs at least if I were to do justice to names such as Shaftesbury, Bolingbroke, Toland, Tyndall, Anthony Collins, all of whom in their various ways were trying to identify something that was common to all religions, some primeval origin of them. However, although many of them are significant, there's one giant who's perhaps the most significant philosopher in the English language to have expressed these deist notions, and who, in fact, although he never admitted himself to be an atheist as such, he was clearly and unarguably the most vividly elegant and eloquent skeptic of them all. I'm referring, of course, to the great Scottish philosopher David Hume.
I have always considered David Hume as approaching as nearly to the idea of a perfectly wise and virtuous man as perhaps the nature of human frailty will allow.